Hello, and welcome to today's video where I'm going to be telling you how to unlock your best reading life using subgenres. So, I've been doing a lot of thinking over the past couple years about what I really enjoy reading because I've been sort of reassessing my own book situation and thinking about what books I want to buy and which ones I'd rather get from the library and things like that. So I've just been doing a lot of thinking about what kinds of books I'm most excited to read. I want to start this off by saying that everyone's going to have their own genres that they're most likely going to gravitate towards. I think on BookTube especially, there is this push to kind of niche down into one certain genre so that your audience can find you based on, like, if you're a fantasy booktuber, then people who like fantasy will come watch you talk about all sorts of fantasy books. And that's mainly what you read, and you don't read other things. And I don't think that's a bad idea business-wise for a booktuber, but I do think that maybe it's a little bit risky to sort of go all in on one genre and forget about everything else in the book world. Here's why I think that. I have heard many people who talk about hitting these reading slumps where they love, I'm going to use fantasy because that's my favorite genre. I don't want to feel like I'm like punching down on anyone. So I'm going to use fantasy as like a reference for a lot of these hypotheticals that I'm talking about. But I might hear someone talk about, like, I've been reading a lot of fantasy and I can't find anything that intrigues me anymore. They feel like they've read most of what they like in that genre, and then new books that they're picking up are disappointing them. And I don't think it's that they don't like fantasy anymore. I don't think it's that the genre has gotten worse. I think it's just the fact that when you focus in on a very narrow reading journey, that it's easy to become bored with current trends. Publishing follows trends. If we're looking at like fantasy, in the 60s and 70s, there was this huge like emergence of fantasy books, but many of them were like carbon copies of The Lord of the Rings, because Tolkien was one of the only like really well-known epic fantasy writers. And so writers who are coming into this genre that was fairly new, not very commercialized at that point, they were writing based off of Tolkien because that was sort of the map that they had for what fantasy is, especially successful fantasy. So at that time in the 60s and 70s, it would have been very difficult, at least in like English countries, to read books that weren't very, very Tolkien-esque, like borderline plagiarism at some points. And so it would make sense if someone read only fantasy that they would start to get tired of these books that were just constantly copying and harkening back to Tolkien. And while obviously the fantasy genre has grown, I think that we still see publishing fall into these sort of trends where a bunch of one type of book is being published and they're sort of putting a lot of their eggs into one basket because you have to strike while the iron's hot. Another example of this is The Hunger Games. When The Hunger Games was popular, how many teenage girl-led dystopian fantasy science fiction trilogies did we see being published in like the early 2010s? So many. And it was just a lot of people going, Hunger Games is super popular. The publishers are looking for the next Hunger Games. And so authors are like, okay, I can write that. I have an idea for it. Let me write it, get it published while Hunger Games is popular. And a lot of people read many of those and were disappointed because not a lot of them actually lived up to the Hunger Games, because it's hard to know what will become a bestseller. There are so many factors involved in that. But you have publishing kind of following this trend. So everywhere you look, there were these YA dystopian series being like pushed all the time for quite a while. And it's gonna be easy to get tired of them. So I have a proposal for you. If you have a favorite genre and you ever get tired of it, I want you to explore other genres. And I especially want you to explore other genres and their subgenres. And the subgenre, I think, is so helpful for revitalizing your reading life. And I'm going to tell you why. I love fantasy. I read a lot of fantasy, and I feel like I'm very down to read lots of different types of fantasy. But as we just talked about, those publishing trends and books that are fairly similar, or if I just read a lot of fantasy in a row, I'm gonna get a little burnt out on it. And that doesn't mean that fantasy is bad or that I don't like it anymore. It's just I need something fresh every once in a while, and then soon I'll be chomping at the bit to get back to the next fantasy book because I love it so much. And so what I've sort of built over my life is these subgenres and these pockets of other genres that I go to sort of cleanse my palate in between reading fantasy books, but also I still enjoy them as much as an amazing fantasy book. Because that's the thing. I don't want to just go read a romance if I'm going to not like it just because I need something different. I want to read a romance I'm going to like. So I need to know what kind of romances I like in order to really cleanse my palate without just throwing in a book that I'm not going to enjoy. So let's talk about romance. I actually really struggle with finding romance books that I enjoy, but I really enjoy romance books when I enjoy them. And so I've been thinking about which books I enjoy and how I can more reliably pick a romance book I'm going to love. So I started thinking and looking back on some of my favorite romance authors, which are Sophie Kinsella and Mary McFarlane. I love both of their works, and I had to really have a think about what is it about them that I like. Oh, and Catherine Center. I also like Catherine Center. What is it about those authors that I enjoy their romances more than a majority of other authors that I've read from? And I sort of landed on this idea of like a rom-com versus a romance. And I think I lean much more towards liking a rom-com than like a fully like earnest romance. So now when I'm looking at books or people are recommending romance books, I'm now sort of looking into, are any of these gonna be like that funny, silly good time? Or are they more of like an earnest, dramatic, really intense romance that I'm maybe not going to enjoy as much? And so that's what I mean by looking at subgenres. I had to really figure out when I want a romance, what subgenre should I be looking at? When I'm adding romances to my TBR, like my want to read eventually TBR, what kinds of romances should I be looking for that I will most likely like? How do I find new authors in romance that I like apart from the three that I've enjoyed? Science fiction is another area where I have been reading science fiction for quite a few years, but I've been spending a lot of that time reading and not liking sci-fi and trying to figure out what is it that I enjoy about science fiction. And I'm still learning. I don't think it's quite as cut and dry as how I feel about the romance genre right now. I feel like I kind of am learning what I like in romance. And science fiction, I do feel more likely to take a chance on a sci-fi and just see if I like it or not. But I think there are definitely some subgenres that I lean towards not liking as much. Doesn't mean I won't try them if, someone recommends them to me, but one of them is military science fiction. I really don't enjoy much military stuff in any books that I read, but especially in science fiction, I tend to find the military sci-fi much more dry and hard to get into than other types of sci-fi. I know I like dystopian, so I can almost always rely on a dystopian to be something that I enjoy, if not love. And I think near future science fiction, where it's like it's not too far off from our current timeline, but maybe it's like 20 years in the future and there's some sort of like technology development that has really changed how society works. I really enjoy that in science fiction, and I don't know how to explain that any more succinctly than I just did, but I really enjoy that in science fiction as well. Space opera is iffy for me, so if I feel like taking a chance, I might pick a space opera. Sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't. I don't think I've read enough of it to know what kind of space opera I like and which ones I don't. So if I'm feeling risky and like I can take a little chance on a book, I'll do that. If not, I will go towards the kind of things that I think I know I'll enjoy. So this is what I would suggest for you. If you feel like you often get bored in your favorite genre, I would suggest you make a sort of recipe for your reading life. So what I do is I read mostly fantasy, but I like to sprinkle in romance, mystery thriller, horror, sci-fi, and very occasionally like a literary or historical fiction. And when I'm reading in a month, I will often read a couple fantasy books, and then I might be feeling the need for like something really fast-paced, so then I might pick up like a romance or a mystery thriller or a horror, something that's going to be short and snappy, really fast-paced, really engaging, and then I might feel ready to go back to fantasy. I'm not often taking a long break from fantasy because I find that just reading a couple things outside of fantasy makes it so that it's easy to go back to fantasy, and I'm often excited to like jump back in because it is one of my favorites. And often with sci-fi, because I do enjoy a lot of sci-fi, even if I'm not always sure how to describe the sci-fi I like, I will often throw like science fiction and fantasy in there together. So I might read 3 or 4 fantasy science fiction and then feel the need to take a break. I might take a longer break in winter to read like holiday romances and try some of those and see if any of them are good. Or for a readathon, I might, lean into more fast-paced reads like mystery, thriller, horror that are going to be really page-turny that I can like get through quickly. So I firmly believe that most people are going to enjoy something in almost every genre. I am very reluctant to say I really don't like this kind of book. Even when I say I don't like military sci-fi, I know there's a couple military sci-fi on my shelves that I think sound really interesting and that I stand a good chance of liking. So I'm not one to like write off any subgenre, but there are definitely subgenres that I lean into more than other genres just because I know that they're working for me most of the time. I hope that's helpful for you. I hope that you'll give some thought to what kinds of genres you read and if maybe there's room for you to branch out more to maybe add more diversity and excitement into your reading life. If you ever get bored with a certain genre, I'd love to know how you sort of get yourself out of that slump with that genre. I think that would be really interesting. And down in the comments, I would love to know if you tend to read mainly 1 or 2 genres or if you like to read widely. I would be very curious to know kind of your preferences in that area. Anyways, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.